Everyone thought I was lucky. That was the lie that settled easily into every conversation, every smile, every polite nod people gave me when they saw where I lived and who I lived with. From the outside, it looked like a blessing, a warm home, a successful son, a well-mannered granddaughter, and a daughter-in-law who knew exactly when to smile. I used to repeat that lie myself, quietly, like a habit I didn't know how to break. Back then, I still believed that silence was the cost of belonging. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life I believed love was proven through endurance. I raised my son, Michael, mostly alone after his father died, learning early how to stretch paychecks and shrink my own needs. Double shifts, bargain aisles, clipping coupons at the kitchen table late at night, meals that looked smaller on my plate so his could look full, those things came naturally to me. When Michael grew up, built his career, married Melissa, and later insisted I move in after a health scare, I told myself this was not dependence. This was family. This was trust. I promised myself I would help, not interfere. I would be grateful. That word followed me everywhere, like a reminder stitched into my skin. In the beginning, nothing seemed wrong. Melissa had a way of performing kindness that put everyone at ease. When friends visited or family gathered, she would touch my arm gently and say things like, "We're so blessed to have her with us." People smiled at me, impressed, and I smiled back, careful not to overstay the moment. My granddaughter, Lily, 15 and already taller than me, knew exactly how to behave in front of adults. "Yes, ma'am." "No, sir." Doors held open. Shoes placed neatly by the mat. Teachers praised her manners. Neighbors called her respectful. And Michael stayed busy, always rushing between work and obligations, assuming that harmony meant no one complained. I didn't blame him. I never did. It was the quiet moments that felt different, though I didn't have words for it yet. The house had a rhythm, and slowly I realized it wasn't set to mine. Meals became more structured, more controlled. Melissa planned everything down to the last detail, and somehow my preferences stopped being part of that plan. "You don't need much," she'd say casually, sliding a modest portion onto my plate, the serving spoon tapping softly against the ceramic. "You've always said you eat light anyway." I had said that once, years ago, and now it followed me like a rule I had written myself. I told myself it was practical, that I was reading too much into it. I finished what was given and cleared my place quietly, listening to the clink of dishes as if that sound could confirm I was still useful. Money felt similar, nothing overt, nothing harsh. My pension checks went where they were supposed to go, into the household flow, and over time they simply stopped feeling like mine. When I needed something, I asked, and when I asked, I waited. Sometimes the answer came quickly, sometimes later, sometimes not at all. I told myself this was how shared households worked, that independence was a young person's luxury. I reminded myself to be grateful. I reminded myself often. Lily never spoke to me with open disrespect. That's what made it so easy to excuse. "Mom says it's better if you use the downstairs bathroom," she mentioned one afternoon, eyes still on her phone, her voice even informational. Another time, passing me in the hallway, "Mom says the living room TV stays off during the day. It throws her off." Each sentence came wrapped in someone else's authority, delivered without attitude, as if rules were simply facts of life, like the weather or the time. I nodded and adjusted my steps, careful not to block her path. Correcting her felt unnecessary, and correcting her mother felt risky in a way I couldn't yet explain. When I tried, gently, to mention feeling out of place, Michael brushed it aside without really listening. He didn't stop what he was doing, just glanced up briefly. "You know how organized Melissa is," he said once. "He's already in his hand. She just likes structure. Don't stress yourself out, Mom." His words weren't cruel. They were light, dismissive in the way busy people can be. I told myself he was tired. I told myself it wasn't personal. So I adjusted. I learned the unspoken schedule. I learned when the kitchen was considered in use and when it wasn't. I learned how softly to close my bedroom door at night so the click of the latch wouldn't carry down the hall. I moved through the house carefully, like someone borrowing space. What troubled me wasn't a single incident. It was the slow accumulation of small shifts. My things quietly relocated, a sweater folded into a different drawer, a chair nudged slightly out of the way. My routines gently corrected, always with a reasonable explanation. My presence acknowledged, but not quite included. None of it was loud enough to point to, nothing dramatic enough to complain about without sounding ungrateful. And in public, everything still looked perfect. Melissa's voice softened. Lily's smiled wider. Michael spoke proudly. I learned, without being told, that there was a right time to speak, and that time was almost never. I began to notice how often decisions were made for me, always framed as concern, efficiency, or convenience. How often my silence was taken as agreement. I started paying attention, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. I listened more than I spoke. I remembered things the way I used to remember grocery prices, quietly, precisely. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself this was just adjustment. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly, the kind of casual visit that catches everyone off guard. We were standing near the doorway, the screen door creaking slightly as it swung shut behind her. She looked at me and asked, kindly, "How are you settling in?" There was a pause, just long enough for me to inhale, before Melissa smiled and replied for me, her tone warm and reassuring. "She's doing great. We keep things simple for her. It just works better that way." The neighbor nodded, satisfied, and moved on. I nodded too, my hand still resting on the cool edge of the door frame. But later, when the house was quiet, I replayed the moment in my mind. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't yet name why. That night, lying awake, I listened to the house settle, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant thud of a door closing upstairs, the familiar sounds of a place that no longer quite felt like mine. I realized how deeply tired I was, not just in my body, but in my sense of self. I had spent so much time trying not to be a burden that I hadn't noticed when my choices began disappearing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply awake in a way I hadn't been before. And for the first time, I understood something that had been hiding in plain sight. Silence hadn't been keeping the peace. It had been keeping me invisible. Everyone still thought things were fine. That belief moved through the house like background noise, steady and unquestioned, the kind you stop noticing until it suddenly goes quiet. After that night when I lay awake listening to doors close and floors settle, nothing on the surface changed. Breakfast still appeared on the counter. Shoes still lined up by the door. Melissa still smiled easily when she spoke to me in front of others. Lily still said good morning. Michael still left early and came home tired. But once you start seeing clearly, you notice how much effort it takes to keep pretending. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce some new resolve. I simply stopped rushing to adjust. I moved a little slower, listened a little longer, paid attention in ways I hadn't needed to before. The difference was subtle, but it required more awareness than silence ever had. When Melissa reorganized the kitchen cabinets again, placing my mug on a higher shelf, I noticed how she didn't ask, how she didn't even look at me while doing it. "It's just easier this way," she said, already turning back to her phone. I nodded, even though reaching that shelf meant standing on my toes and steadying myself against the counter. Later, I realized the step stool that used to sit nearby had been folded and tucked into the garage. No announcement. No explanation. Just one less option quietly removed. The mug felt heavier in my hand than it used to, or maybe that was just the realization settling in. Meals became quieter. Portions stayed the same, but the tone around them shifted. Comments that sounded harmless carried a different weight once you knew to listen. "You didn't finish again," Melissa remarked one evening, glancing at my plate. "We should really watch waste." The word waste lingered in the air longer than it needed to. Lily looked up briefly, then back to her screen. Michael asked about work and didn't notice the pause. I swallowed what was left, even though I wasn't hungry anymore, even though my stomach felt tight for reasons that had nothing to do with food. The house rules grew more defined without ever being written down. Quiet hours. Preferred pathways through rooms. The living room chair I used most often slowly became a place Lily left her backpack or jacket, not deliberately, just consistently. When I moved it aside, she'd say, "Oh, sorry, Grandma," in a voice that sounded practiced, polite, distant. She never argued. She never needed to. The system argued for her. I began choosing different places to sit, different times to read, different routes to move through the house. I told myself this was compromise. I told myself this was maturity. Michael remained unchanged in the way only someone comfortable can be. When I mentioned, carefully, that I felt a bit crowded lately, he smiled and kissed the top of my head. "You know it's just temporary," he said. "We'll figure something out." There was no timeline attached to those words, no urgency. They floated between us like a promise meant to soothe, not solve. I didn't push. I didn't want to be another problem waiting at the end of his day. It was the patterns that sharpened first, not the emotions. How decisions were always framed as already made. How questions were answered with explanations instead of options. How often Melissa spoke for me without checking if her words matched my thoughts. At a family gathering, when someone asked how I liked living with them, she laughed lightly and said, "She's so low maintenance. We hardly hear from her." Everyone chuckled. I smiled, feeling the chair press firmly against my back, the room suddenly louder than before. Lily's role shifted almost without notice. She began reminding me of rules before I broke them. "Mom says the washer's full today," she'd mention as I carried laundry down the hall. "Mom says you should rest more," she said once, closing the window I'd opened for air. None of it was cruel. It was efficient. I wondered when she had stopped seeing me as someone with preferences and started seeing me as someone to manage. Then I wondered how long I had been helping teach her that. One afternoon, I missed a step coming down the stairs and caught myself just in time, my hand gripping the railing hard enough to leave my palm aching. No one saw. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, listening to the faint hum of the television downstairs. It occurred to me that if I had fallen, the story would have been simple. An accident. An unfortunate moment. No one would have asked what it felt like to move through a house that wasn't quite yours. No one would have asked how carefully I'd been walking for months. I started noticing what was said when people thought I wasn't listening. How Melissa's tone shifted when she spoke about me to Michael in the next room, practical, efficient. The spare key I used to keep in my purse no longer fit the lock on the side door. When I mentioned it casually, Michael frowned and said, "Huh, that's weird. Melissa probably switched it out." Probably. That word did a lot of work in that house. I adjusted again, but this time I knew what I was doing. I learned which doors were easier, which hours were smoother. I learned when to move and when to stay put. The house didn't feel hostile. It felt managed. There's a difference. Hostility announces itself. Management just narrows your options until you stop noticing the loss. Lily adapted faster than anyone. She always did. "Mom says you shouldn't go out back alone," she mentioned one afternoon as I reached for my sweater. Her tone was neutral, informative. The latch sticks sometimes. I smiled and thanked her, even though the back door had been my favorite place to stand in the evenings, the air cooler there, the noise softer. She wasn't warning me. She was redirecting me. And she thought she was helping. Michael stayed busy. Deadlines. Meetings. Long calls taken in the car. When he was home, he looked relieved to be off duty. I didn't want to put anything heavy in his hands, so I kept my observations to myself. I watched instead. I noted how often Melissa spoke about logistics and structure, how she framed every restriction as protection. "We just want everyone safe. It's easier this way. This works better for the household." The language was clean, responsible, hard to argue with unless you named what it erased. One morning, I found my mail stacked neatly on the counter, already opened. Nothing missing. Just sorted. "I thought I'd help," Melissa said when she saw me looking at it. "It can be overwhelming." I nodded, even though my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't the mail. It was the assumption. The quiet decision made on my behalf. The neighbor, Karen, caught me by the fence one afternoon. We'd spoken before, small talk, weather. Nothing personal. This time she tilted her head and asked, "You settling in okay? Big adjustment, living with your kids?" It was a simple question. Ordinary. But something about the way she waited for the answer made my throat close. I said yes, of course. She smiled, but her eyes lingered a second longer than polite. "Well," she said gently, "don't forget you still get to be you." That stayed with me. Not because it was profound, but because no one in the house had said anything like that in months. The final shift came quietly. One evening, I reached for my purse to run a quick errand and found it moved from its usual place. Not gone. Just relocated to a drawer in the hall. "I didn't want it getting knocked over," Melissa explained later. "We're trying to keep things streamlined." Streamlined. I pictured myself reduced to a line, thin and easy to step over. That night, lying in bed, I didn't feel angry. I felt certain. This wasn't about safety or efficiency. It was about control wearing sensible shoes. I understood then that nothing would reset unless I stopped shrinking to fit. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't rehearse speeches. I simply decided that my silence would no longer be automatic. I would choose it when it served me, not when it erased me. The house was quiet as I turned off the lamp. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked softly into place. I knew now what that sound meant. And I also knew this. Locks only matter if you believe you don't deserve the key. By the time I understood the shape of things, I also understood something else that felt almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Nothing changes if you announce it. Change happens when you stop feeding the pattern. For years, I had mistaken patience for peace and silence for kindness. I thought endurance earned respect. It doesn't. It only teaches people how much you're willing to lose without a sound. So I didn't protest the latch on the door or question the codes or ask for my key back. I let the house believe it had finished arranging me. There's comfort in thinking a problem has been handled. People relax when they think the work is done. They stop watching their hands. They stop counting. I started keeping track instead. Not with notes or lists or anything that could be found and questioned. Just quietly, the way you remember grocery prices when money is tight and every dollar has a memory attached to it. I noticed times. Patterns. Which mornings felt rushed and which evenings felt supervised. I noticed how instructions were never given directly when Michael was home, how decisions appeared already made the moment he left. The difference between what was said out loud and what was decided in silence grew sharper every day. In front of others, Melissa remained composed, thoughtful, almost gentle. She likes routine, she told people with a warm smile. It keeps her comfortable. Comfort became the word she used when she meant control. I would hear my name followed by reassurance, followed by laughter. Behind the same door, her voice flattened, efficient, and final. Suggestions became rules. Choices arrived wrapped as favors. I learned how quickly kindness can turn into policy when it isn't questioned. Michael stayed steady in his distance. He trusted what he could see because it required nothing more from him. When he asked, "Everything okay?" it wasn't concern. It was maintenance. I answered the way people do when they don't want repairs done. "I'm fine." Fine became my camouflage. Fine meant no stories, no follow-ups, no time wasted on details he didn't want to carry home from work. Lily noticed everything. Children always do. I could see her learning which version of her mother belonged in which room, how voices changed depending on who was present. She didn't argue. She didn't mock. She mirrored. When she reminded me of a rule, her tone was calm, practiced, almost managerial. That realization hurt more than the rules themselves. She wasn't being unkind. She was being trained. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped explaining myself. If I stayed in my room longer than usual, I didn't apologize. If I went to bed early, I didn't announce it. I became polite, brief, neutral. The kind of quiet that doesn't invite response. It unsettled Melissa more than any confrontation ever could have. Control relies on reaction. Silence without submission throws it off balance. The house adjusted in small, telling ways. Conversations ended faster. Doors closed more carefully. Once, I found my medication moved again, lined up neatly in a different drawer like a suggestion disguised as order. I said nothing. Later, I overheard Melissa telling Michael, "She's been so much easier lately." He sounded relieved when he agreed. Easier. That word settled somewhere deep in my chest. Easier meant contained. Easier meant manageable. I began making choices that didn't announce themselves. I scheduled my appointments directly. I rerouted mail without mentioning it. I gathered copies of documents I hadn't needed in years, not because I planned to use them immediately, but because I finally understood that access is power. Independence doesn't disappear overnight. It fades when you stop guarding the small things. Karen waved from across the yard one morning and called out, "You look lighter these days." I smiled, surprised by the truth in it. I hadn't lost weight. I had lost the habit of bracing myself. One afternoon, Melissa hosted a small gathering. Parents from Lily's school, a couple of neighbors, someone from Michael's office. I stayed in the background, refilling glasses, listening more than speaking. Melissa placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "She's doing so well now. We've got a good system." People nodded. Systems sound responsible. No one questions them. But I noticed who watched me when she said it. Karen did, and so did one of Michael's coworkers, a woman who didn't smile immediately, who paused just long enough for curiosity to take root. The truth doesn't need a microphone. It only needs the right ears at the right moment. That night, lying in bed, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being inconvenient. Not of being alone. Fear had kept me flexible. Clarity made me solid. I didn't need to expose anything yet. I didn't need justice delivered loudly or quickly. I needed patience. I needed consistency. I needed to let the structure show itself fully before it could collapse under its own weight. I slept better than I had in months. Not because things were fixed, but because I finally knew where I stood. I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer need my voice to be heard. In the quiet of the house, something settled into place. Not revenge. Not anger. Readiness. And readiness, I learned, is what turns observation into power. Everyone believed the house had found its balance again. That was the most convincing illusion of all. Balance looks peaceful when no one is checking who is carrying the weight. I didn't announce my shift. I didn't demand respect or reclaim space out loud. I simply stopped being available for quiet control. When Melissa spoke on my behalf, I corrected her gently, not with emotion but with facts. When plans were made around me instead of with me, I asked small questions that couldn't be brushed aside. Not confrontational ones. Practical ones. The kind that sound harmless, but force clarity into the room whether anyone wants it or not. Michael noticed before he understood. He started hesitating when he repeated things Melissa had already decided. His sentences ended differently now, less confident, more unfinished. One evening he said, "Melissa thinks this is best," and I answered, calmly, "I'll wait until you tell me what you think." The room didn't tense. It sharpened. He looked at me like someone hearing a familiar voice in a new register. For the first time in years. He didn't answer right away. I watched how routine shifted when I stopped absorbing friction. Meals weren't late by accident anymore. My medicine wasn't forgotten. Doors that had once been closed automatically stayed open. Melissa didn't change her tone, but her timing changed. She waited now. She observed. Control doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It becomes cautious. The truth didn't arrive with drama. It arrived through logistics, the way real life always reveals itself. A neighbor asked why my mail had been redirected weeks ago. A school form Lily brought home needed a guardian's signature that had already been filled in. A clinic called to confirm an appointment I hadn't scheduled. Each moment was small, almost forgettable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that no explanation could soften. Melissa laughed things off the way skilled people do. Light, quick, efficient. She said I was forgetful, confused, tired. The words were polished, almost kind. But once spoken aloud, they no longer belonged only to her. Michael heard them. Really heard them. Confusion had never been part of my story before. He knew that. The conversation happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No raised voices. No witnesses. Just three people sitting in a room where certainty had finally thinned enough for truth to pass through. Michael asked when things started changing. I told him they hadn't. They had only been named. I didn't accuse. I described. I spoke about how care slowly turns into management when no one pushes back. How silence is often mistaken for consent. How easy it is to believe everything is fine when inconvenience never reaches you. He asked questions then. Not defensive ones. Curious ones. The kind he should have asked years ago. Melissa answered smoothly at first, the way people do when they are used to being believed. But clarity doesn't require mistakes to expose itself. It only requires comparison. Her answers didn't collapse. They didn't need to. They simply didn't align anymore. Lily stood near the doorway, quiet, absorbing more than anyone realized. I caught her eye and smiled. Not to reassure her. To release her. Children should never feel responsible for the emotional weather of a house. She didn't need explanations. She needed permission not to carry what wasn't hers. Michael leaned back after a long silence and said, quietly, I didn't see it. There was no drama in his voice. No performance. Just recognition. That sentence carried more accountability than any apology ever could. He didn't ask me to forgive. He didn't ask Melissa to defend herself. He understood something fundamental had shifted, and it wasn't going back to the way it was. What followed wasn't punishment. It was adjustment. Access returned. Decisions became discussions. Schedules were shared instead of assigned. Melissa stayed polite, careful, distant. Not defeated. Exposed. When control loses invisibility, it loses speed. She could no longer move the house without resistance, and that changed everything. I didn't leave right away. I didn't need to. Independence isn't about location. It's about leverage. I stayed because I chose to, not because I was placed. And that distinction altered the entire dynamic. When you stay by choice, the walls stop closing in. They start listening. Michael checked in more. Not out of guilt, but awareness. Lily relaxed in small ways that mattered more than words. Melissa adjusted her behavior without ever naming why. No one announced the change. Everyone felt it. One evening, as I locked my own door, I realized something that made me smile. They were watching me now. Measuring. Learning my rhythm the way I had once learned theirs. Not because they feared me, but because they finally understood I wasn't invisible. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my value. And once that happens, a house has no choice but to rearrange itself around you. If you believe elders deserve respect, not quiet erasure, please like and subscribe. Stories like this exist because someone chooses to listen.